Oh, hey, didn't see you there. It's Ryan here, and you know what that means, right? It means I'm making a new channel. Woohoo! Hey, Ryan, is this channel gonna last as long as... Hey, Dumpus, how about you learn what an aged and established backup account is? Also, this new channel is going to be for non-serious stuff, but maybe also some serious stuff. The reason being that this channel, The Alternative Hypothesis, is clearly being algorithmed. And I want a platform. I want to one day be big on YouTube. And from there, I'll see what I can do. And The Alternative Hypothesis will not be allowed by YouTube to become a major account. So I've decided to go audio only on this channel, which is way less work for me and allows me to focus on what I'm good at, or at least what I think I'm good at. Opinions may vary. It could be useful. Some people may listen, learn things, find it interesting, think of stuff to tell friends, whatever. But for a lot of viewers, it just means more alt-type videos because they just listen to the audio anyway. And because I don't have to do all that editing. Plus, you get to hear all the content that was previously cut in the edited video. The breathing, the lip smacking, the ums and ahs. It's a real bonus for you. And if you're interested in the new channel, you can check out my review of World War I, presented in glorious 240p, where I cover all the plot holes, conveniences, and bad decisions the leaders make for the sake of starting a war and moving the plot along. Really bad writing, really contrived, totally ripped off the Star Wars Empire aesthetic, and overall just not believable. But you didn't click on this video to hear me babble on aimlessly and not get to the point. Well, anyway, that's enough announcement. On to Ryan talks into the microphone for an hour. So people have deeply entrenched beliefs. You talk to people and you find all sorts of resistance. They don't just weigh the facts and then change their position the moment the evidence is in front of them. You know, that the position in front of them, in theory, would tell them to change their position. Now, children are more likely to do this, to just change their position on a dime. But so are much more intelligent adults. And I'm going to use the term closed and open-mindedness, but I don't mean it pejoratively. Obviously, closed-minded behavior evolved. It worked. It passed the crucible of evolution. So we shouldn't just poo-poo it. And I can think of several reasons to be closed-minded. First is the inability to argue doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. It just means you can't argue with the person in front of you. Say you have some law against eating shellfish or pork, or a law against homosexuality. These are examples of very common archaic laws that were common, before modern times, that to the modern mind just seem sort of senseless. But groups that had these laws persisted. Now, it could just be a spandrel. Spandrels being things that a successful group or organism or institution has that has nothing to do with the success of that thing, but are just coincidentally part of that thing. And that thing multiplies and carries forward this spandrel that has nothing to do with its success, but is sort of distinctive, just by chance. But say all your life you were told it was immoral to eat shellfish or engage in sodomy. Then some modern man comes up to you to teach you there's no rational reason to prohibit such things. If you were open-minded and just followed his advice because you had no rational or logical arguments against it, you'd rescind those laws, and then you'd have a bunch of disease and falling reproduction rates, and your group would lose to groups that did prohibit the eating of shellfish and homosexuality. In an ancient context, that's what open-mindedness would get you. It would get you disease and falling fertility rates, at least in regards to those two things. Now today, we know about germs. The modern man isn't on the cutting edge of disease research, but he knows enough to vaguely know that certain actions can cause disease, and so a little bit more knowledge recapitulates the old bigotries and explains why they evolved. So groups where people conform to the old bigotries, even if they couldn't articulate the logic behind them, which they almost never could because there's no evolutionary benefit to adding the additional brain power needed to articulate why you believe something, those groups persisted. While groups that were more intellectual and childlike, they weren't as successful. A second reason I can think of is individual evolutionary adaptation. Groups of people evolve, but so do individuals that must operate within groups, and so these effects stack. A woman is more likely to seek out a mate who is conformist and closed-minded. Now, they don't like to use those terms, but today that's obviously true. You have somebody who said, hey baby, Jews did 9/11. Okay, that's a little bit of a turnoff. Okay, so women seek out mates who are conformist and closed-minded. Okay, because women who sought out those kinds of mates tended to be more reproductively successful in the past. Men are more likely to associate with other men who are conformist than with nonconformist men. Again, because those men tend to be more reproductively successful. Even if a man is himself nonconformist in his attitudes, he's more likely to seek out conformist men as companions and conformist women as mates than other nonconformists. Okay? If he has a choice. And lastly, men are more likely to just be conformist themselves. Not more than women. Humans are more likely to be conformist themselves. So even if any one of these effects were weak, they'll stack. The effects stack. The tendency of a woman seeking out conformist mates may be only 10% of her criteria for seeking out a mate, right? And the tendency of a male to seek out male companionship may be only 10% explained by conformity. And your personal material success as an individual, divorced from the group, that effects may only be 10% a function of your conformity to group norms. But because groups of people are enmeshed, and so the benefits of conformity, they stack in multiple ways in multiple directions. So even a small effect can end up being deterministic over a long period of time in a large population, can end up being deterministic in what kind of people are going to evolve. So this creates a situation where women don't seem monstrously biased in favor of conformist males, slightly but not monstrously. Male companies aren't monstrously biased towards conformist companions, and your own personal material success isn't dismally determined by conformity to groups and practices. But it's a bunch of little effects that add up, and the result ends up being powerful even if no individual class of actors seems monstrously bigoted. Okay, so that's the second reason. And the third reason I've thought of people being closed-minded isn't directly evolutionary, although, I mean, everything ultimately is, but all beliefs that you have are genes expressed in environment. So, genetic beliefs are not something, people have they just want to write this off. Okay, think about some genetic beliefs we all accept. Okay, a fear of heights, fear of enclosed spaces, fear of bugs, or a desire to care for your baby, right? These are all beliefs everyone has, and they're referred to as instincts. But they have them to different degrees, to greater or lesser degrees. So these are undeniably genetic beliefs. Even if we can't point to the specific genes or the specific neurological correlates that cause these beliefs, they're obviously there. Humans are afraid of heights more than birds are. Humans are weirded out by bugs more than anteaters are. Humans are grossed out by feces more than canines are. Now, obviously, dogs won't eat their own vomit, for example, because they know that they physiologically can. They didn't go to dog school and get taught that they could safely eat their own vomit. No, their psychology co-evolved with their physiology. Same with birds not being afraid of heights. And no little child ever had to be taught that he couldn't eat his own vomit. He is just instinctively repulsed by it. Humans are afraid of entering dark, cramped spaces because getting stuck in there could mean death. Now, rats and other mammals that evolved in those environments don't have that instinct, or at least not to anywhere near the same degree. There's mazes with like little tiny crevices that little mice can squeeze through, which and I think most people would be terrified to go through if you had a human-sized maze like that. But they're not immutable. Humans can, through experience, be conditioned to have less of a fear of heights, for example. Mountain climbers are, as a group, probably less genetically afraid of heights to start with. But the more you do something, the less afraid you are. You overcome your instinct. So when we get to religion and politics, I universally run up against arguments that such religious and political beliefs can't be genetically based because they're malleable. But your fear of heights, your fear of bugs, your fear of enclosed spaces, and your revulsion to vomit and feces, that's also malleable. Your sexuality is also somewhat malleable too, although this tends to be radically overstated. Males generally have an attraction to the female form, but if you watch enough porn, you'll begin to associate big dicks with arousal. Now, this doesn't nullify the fact that the genetic basis of your sexuality is the woman, and even if you're a porn addict, straight men rarely get conditioned enough to where they can be aroused by just the guy. But with political and religious views, it's more complicated because there's an innate class of belief, but also the very particular circumstances of your time. For example, the heritability of any specific religion is basically zero. This is studies, true facts, this is true. But the heritability of religiosity is around 0.5. So about half of all variance of religiosity is a function of variance in genetics in the West, generally. NATO countries, we'll say. NATO countries aside from Turkey, which I shouldn't have to clarify that, but yeah. NATO countries aside from Turkey. Now, total religiosity for the whole population can go up and down. But, this is the interactions of people creating new environmental contexts. But within that environmental context, different individuals have different levels of genetic predisposition to religiosity. And once this is established, how on earth could it not be the case that variance in political views are at least somewhat a product of genetic variance? If religiosity is, Now, we don't have to actually speculate on this because twin studies already show this. And I'll link in the description, blah, blah. And what you find is that in the US, it's about 0.4 overall for what it is we call political views. But for immigration, it's about 0.6. So one's views on immigration are a little bit more a function of genetic variance than political views in general. Now, for an idea of how profound this is, using the same twin studies methods, fear of dangerous animals, the heritability of that is around 0.46. Fear of blood is between 0.36 and 0.37. And you may have experienced this knowing someone who has a fear of blood that they've just always had. They haven't had any particular experience about it. Now, in movies, everything comes from some dramatic experience because they can make a scene about it. And people who watch lots of movies end up with a very warped sense of the world because in movies, everything is environmental. Nobody is just afraid of something, or nobody is just good at something because of their genes, or is just a shitty person because of their genes. There's always some event that causes people to be a certain way, right? And people who have like this very Hollywood notion of morality end up having very stupid ideas about the way the world actually is. Fear of heights has conflicting heritability estimates. Now, derived from father to daughter, it's 0.82. From mother to son, it's 0.92. But from mother to daughter, it's only 0.52. So anywhere from 0.52 to 0.92 is a heritability of agoraphobia or something, fear of heights. So the heritability of political views, it's in the same ballpark as the heritability of phobias, which we all know to be genetic in origin because there's no plausible environmental explanation for the transmission of the fear of heights. I mean, you're not dangling your infant over mountains and stuff. So, I mean, maybe, but so few people are doing that, it's not going to really factor into the population heritability number. Okay. Now, here's a very simple way to look at the heritability of political views, and that is the fairness response. This is an obviously instinctive response. Nobody is taught to do this. Nobody is taught about fairness. Little kids, as soon as they're just taught the word fair and unfair and what it means, they immediately start using it. They never have to be taught that unfair is bad or anything. They get it straight away. As soon as you give them the language to express that thought, they're expressing it all the time. Now, in experiments where you have people and a sum of money, and one person decides how much both participants get. So the other guy who doesn't get to decide how the money is split, he can choose to accept the deal, reject it, and if he rejects the deal, then both participants get no money. So one person is deciding how to split the money between the two participants, and the other participant, who doesn't get to decide how it's split, can decide to accept the deal or reject the deal and cause both people to get $0. And past a certain point, people will start rejecting money because they know the other person is getting more. So they'll just reject it. They'll say, no, I'd rather have neither of us get any money than for me to get less. And this experiment was replicated in chimpanzees. What the researchers did was they'd have a little tray full of food, and each chimp was separated from each other in little cells on either side. And the researcher would slide the tray back and forth, and only one chimp would have access to the food tray at a time. And giving one chimp access to the food tray, but not the other, and would go back and forth. And sometimes the researcher would give one chimp more food than the other. But the thing is, in this situation, at any time, a chimp could pull a cord and flip the tray. And the chimps knew this. They were taught this. They were shown this. So the chimps knew that they could pull the cord and basically, make all the food out of reach for both chimps. And the chimps knew that they could do this. Now, when the human was being unfair, giving one chimp more food than the other, neither chimp would flip the tray. They would accept that they were getting less food, and they wouldn't chimp out, really. But there was another condition where one of the chimps decided how long the tray was in front of him versus how long it was in front of the chimp in the other cell. And when the other chimp was deciding, and that chimp was deciding, was being unfair in the distribution of the food, which the chimp tend to do, not surprisingly. The chimp that wasn't deciding how much food they get, he very often flipped the tray. In fact, in almost every instance, the chimp who wasn't deciding how much food both the chimps got flipped the tray. So chimps are this way too. If they're not getting what they think of as their fair share of food, they'll make it so nobody gets any food. Okay? And those dots are so close, I don't think you really even need to connect them, how that applies to politics. When you have these super rich people who make money off of primarily white Americans, and then to be charitable, they give the wealth they generated by extracting surplus value from white Americans and then just give it to Africans who had nothing to do with their wealth, I and many others have a visceral response to just destroy their wealth. Or Jeff Bezos, if I could, I would destroy Amazon. Not replace it with anything, not redistribute it. I mean, if it could be redistributed, fine, but if I couldn't, I would just destroy it. I'd flip the tray. No cake for anyone. And some people are genetically predisposed to think more this way than others. And from an evolutionary perspective, you could think of costs and benefits to this strategy. And I hypothesize, having this experiment for humans, that this experiment could tell us a person's I could think of as their latent socialism. And for me, it's very high. I will flip the tray at the slightest inequality. I have no tolerance. Now, out in the wild, there's all sorts of ideology and all sorts of propaganda that I think on net causes people to be far more tolerant of inequality than they would be in the absence of all this. One such belief is that rich people are smart or innovative or particularly hardworking, when in reality they're just lucky, and that'll be a topic for another time. Now, for those who have been around since the Fringe Elements days, you may wonder how someone like me, who has such high, what I'm calling latent socialism, was once a Lolbert. Well, Lolbertism, in effect justifies inequality. That's not the purpose. It's not like some guys twirling their mustaches, smoking cigars, consciously set out to do that. But that's just one thing that Lolbertism happens to do. And if you're infected with Lolbertism, you're going to imagine that Jeff Bezos is rich because Amazon was innovative or Bezos was really smart or something, none of which is true. It's a whole system of belief that imagines the market to be the super rational emergent calculator that balances value out properly, and any abuses are ruthlessly punished by competition. Okay. For me, I don't know if I have a high genetic predisposition to religiosity or not. I mean, I'm an atheist right now in my current incarnation at this point in history, but none of my family is or was atheist. Will my children be religious? I don't know. See, I became an atheist because I was trying to read the Bible and make it work. And I was pushing revelations on everyone at my church, saying, yeah, sure, the Gospels are nice, and follow Jesus, and here's how you get to salvation. But if you really believe this book is true, should we not be constantly searching for the signs of the end times? Now, people who do that, people who are obsessed with revelations and looking for the signs of the end times, you might think these people are like the most far gone, that they're the hyper-religious kooks. And I suspect that's not the case. I suspect it's the opposite. That was actually the road towards the end of religiosity for me. Right? I saw it was the people who were not interested in revelations as being the real kooks, because what were they doing? Is this book real or not? Or how much my church said homosexuality was okay, or that it was okay to have woman preachers. Guy, I think Jesus was very clear on this. Are we Christians or not? I couldn't just pick and choose because Jesus said quite clearly, and I can't quote scripture anymore, but I knew Jesus said you couldn't just cherry pick which beliefs to follow. It's an all or nothing doctrine, all or nothing. So, all. And because of this, I was not outcast by my own church, but I was somewhat marginalized. So these people in my church weren't fundamentally following the Bible as best they conceived of doing so. So it was just me. And when it's just me, I think about all this stuff myself. I become judge and jury on what I think is true in this book, because at that point, because I was marginalized, there were now no authorities that I could fall back on. I couldn't turn off my brain and just trust the church, because the church so blatantly ignored whatever teachings happened to be politically inexpedient at their place and time in history. So it's just me. So I just thought about everything said and concluded, this is just a bunch of retards from the Middle East. Not much different from the retards who are there today, and along with the claims being outright fanciful and mystical and demanding to be taken on faith, it's also fruit of the poisonous tree. That poisonous tree being Semitic peoples. Okay? And at that young age, my already high what I now sort of retrospectively recognize my high genetic predisposition to socialism, I just sort of defaulted to identifying with Marxism for a bit. Not very long, and there's really not a whole lot to talk about on that. That's very brief, not that big a deal. Then I got sucked into neoconservatism. Not like rah-rah George Bush, but became a real advocate of America just invading the world and imposing our system on the world, since the U.S. is way nicer than most of the world. And so I thought it must be the system, because I wasn't aware of genetic variations between populations back then. That thought hadn't entered my mind. My only frame of reference was all these trinket environmental explanations. So it must be democracy, it must be the free market, it must be whatever. Now, did I think the U.S. was the best? No. But it's certainly better than anywhere the U.S. was invading. Capitalism is certainly better than feudalism. Marx was very clear about that. And so a global crusade to impose capitalism around the world on the pre-capitalist traditional economies around the world, what I now recognize as the traditional economies, I thought that would be a good thing. But at the American Enterprise Institute, which was pushing true neoconservatism, not just like blind support for whatever war the U.S. happens to be in today, but a true global crusade to impose capitalism worldwide, on their website, I saw a talk by Charles Murray, right next to one by Francis Fukuyama. So I heard Charles Murray in his little talk mentioning group differences in genetic intelligence and that they're probably somewhat genetic in origin. And this may be where I'm a bit odd, because I listened to what Charles Murray was saying, and I immediately grasped that what he was saying was big if true, really big if true. Like if true, this would completely refute most beliefs people have about things. And what I didn't get was how the guys at AEI who were pushing, at AEI at the time, I don't know what they're doing now, but at the time they were pushing true ideological neoconservatism, right? The gap in the steam thing. And they didn't understand that, that what Murray was saying would fundamentally undermine their whole project. And why would they let this guy speak who was saying something that, when taken to its logical conclusion, would imply that the global capitalist crusade would be utterly doomed to fail? Right? Because, are these people going to embrace what it is you're selling? So I read the bell curve, and then immediately after reading the bell curve, I tried to find refutations. And so my views on hereditarianism started to form not in actually reading the bell curve. That's because I'm reading the bell curve and I'm thinking, okay, what's the other side? What's the other side? What's the other side? Because remember, at this point, I'm not a hereditarian yet, right? I'm in a state of flux. So I'm reading like a variety of refutations from multiple sources, but I would get annoyed because, first off, they were just straw man Murray. And also, they seemed to be fixated on refuting Murray as opposed to presenting a case that populations don't differ in innate intelligence. Now, at the time, I hadn't read the G Factor or anything by Rushton or Lin. And later I stopped reading sort of the big names and just went to reading, studies straight. And that sort of occurred around 2008, 2009, when I sort of shifted away from like the books to just reading studies myself. And so I didn't know any of this stuff. I literally just read the bell curve. But even then I was annoyed because, to me, like, it was obvious that IQ is just a proxy for intelligence, which can be environmentally stretched to a degree, but there's an underlying latent genetic tendency. Now, this underlying latent genetic tendency has been quantified in genetic G, or genetic general intelligence, but I didn't know that then. And these people, they were obsessed with this or that problem with IQ. And I was like, and again, I'm not a partisan hereditarian at this point, like I kind of am now. I try to check myself a little bit, but I'm a lot more biased now than I was then. But even then, I was reading these articles and I was like, Guy, what are you doing? Are you going to talk about the real underlying thing in itself? This latent genetic intelligence? Or are you going to prattle on about some limitation of this measurement instrument that we're using? Right? And later, the more I read, later found out that what they were saying was just outright incorrect. And nobody seems to be interested in showing extreme environmentality for all traits. They're obsessed with trying to debunk IQ tests or this method some researcher used. And it's like, hey, clown, you've got a case to make. I don't care about IQ tests per se. Are you ever going to get to dealing with the underlying thing in itself? Intelligence, cognitive abilities. How the hell did all these identifiable populations, like races, or even people from different parts of Ireland, how all these groups just so happen to end up with identical genetic predisposition to all cognitive traits? Despite today, as best we can measure, they don't have expressed intelligence of equal levels. But you say that's all to environment. Okay, well, how did the equal underlying latent genetic abilities, how did that come about? And so it was actually in reading the responses that I developed a bias against environmental explanations, because I was thinking, hey, you guys have a case to make. This or that little pot shot at a method is irrelevant to the basic question that you're not even touching. You need to show equality. Where's the equal? Show me this equal. And they never do. It's just, Lynn measured Africa's IQ wrong by having a study of people from a psych ward. Okay, where are you going with that? What do you think the genetic intelligence predisposition for Africans is then? The same as Iceland? The same as Thailand? The same as Korea? What? And it's the same feeling I got when I was in the church. I'm thinking about other members in the congregation. Hey, Guy, this Bible says no gays. Your son is gay. What are you going to do about it? He's going to hell. That's right. It's like the dwarf pointing to the book. It says you're going to hell. And now, obviously, I don't believe that now, but at the time, it's like, are you going to make this work or not? And with the equal thing, it's like, Guy, I don't care about your needlings of Lynn or Rushton or whatever. I don't care that Murray did a regression wrong or something. What is true? You say all these continental populations are all the same in the brain. Okay. Well, by what methodology did you come to that conclusion? Because it sounds really, really, really unlikely. And look, doesn't matter if they reach some genetic threshold you think they need to reach to be called a distinct race. That's a category game. And even then, I was very aware that humans aren't separate race. That's just a category game. Now, when I first heard it, I thought what they were saying was correct. Later on, I found out they're wrong. But even if you just take what they're saying at face value, who cares? You got these people over here, and you got these people over here, and they'll tell you who they are, okay? It's not some big mystery who the black people and the white people are. Right? Well, there's more variation within than between. Guy, that's not answering the question. It doesn't matter if these groups differ on a single allele frequency. It could just be one C replaced by a G or whatever. Saying there's more variation within than between humans, or they don't meet X criteria for being distinct subspecies. All right. Later, I found out that they were straight up wrong about that. But whatever. That doesn't get you to equal. I'm reading these critiques, and as I'm reading through it, it's the same sort of response that I had when reading Hans Hermann Hoppe's Private Production of Defense, right? I was reading Hoppe's Private Production of Defense. It's like, okay, so how does he solve the free rider problem? Holy shit, he doesn't solve the free rider. He doesn't do it, right? And I'm reading like these critiques of hereditarians, and I'm looking for like a case for equal, and they don't do it. It's like, how the hell do we get to equal? None of them do it. There's no case for equal. Where is it? And like fundamentally, like, see, because I'm trying to make it work, like for real work. Like I was trying to make Christianity work. I was trying to make equal work. And none of the guys pushing equal were making a case for it. It was all just critiques. And even at the time, like, I didn't know as much as I do now, but at the time, I was like, I'm sure Murray could respond to this in a way that will sound convincing to, like, whatever. I don't care about your critiques. I want to know what is. And like, none of these critiques that they make, even if true, would be devastating. And as I later found out, they're mostly not true. And some of the stuff about Lynn ended up being true. But it's mostly lies and some, like, trinket critiques that don't change the outcome in any meaningful way. And this is all they do. Like, Sean doesn't make a video arguing for equal. He makes a video critiquing. Okay? Vaush doesn't talk about how all the groups ended up the same in the brain. He just critiques people who believe in evolution. And the same thing sort of happened with Lolbertism with me. Now that's more complicated. It's not quite as analogous because Lolberts aren't comprehensively wrong. I mean, the rise of capitalism led to the Industrial Revolution and the world as we know it. And it's also more complicated because there's various flavors of Lolbertism. But see, I looked into the Kool-Aid and then tried to make it work. So, big question, law and defense, right? So I'm thinking, okay, so Lolbertism is true, and I'm thinking, and I sort of gravitated towards anarchism. It was called anarcho-capitalism, as it was called. So, but the big question for anarcho-capitalists is always law and defense. Roads is a stupid critique. Roads are dealt with very easily by markets. That's a dumb argument. You know, large highway roads, toll roads, they work just fine. Fast pass, it's electronic, it works perfectly. And it deals with traffic a lot better. People don't drive willy-nilly. And as for roads around houses, private housing developments build their own roads all the time. It's a complete non-issue. But so the big question, law and defense. Why is that a state thing? And a free market is constrained by law. Property rights have to be enforced. That comes from law, which historically has come from a state. So, what are some examples of stateless societies without law? Stateless societies with law, without a centralized lawmaking institution. That's sort of how, that's just sort of happened. That's how I ended up defining a state. Well, Ireland's Brehon Law was an example. The Icelandic Althing was an example. The Western U.S. territories before statehood had polycentric-ish legal arrangements. And I also would bring up the Catalonian anarchists, the recovered factories of Argentina, the Ukraine Free State, and the kibbutzim in Israel as examples of polycentric law. That is law that exists without one explicit law-making entity. And I pointed out that, okay, in a stateless society, you can have a forced religion, you can have the abolition of private land property, you can have sodomy and adultery punishable by death, and you can have disputes settled by duels. All sorts of things. Polycentric law doesn't necessarily lead to capitalism as we know it. Okay, so in real terms, it's not like... In real terms, not like the wackos who call themselves anarchists because they want chaos and communism, but in real terms, real anarchism is polycentric law. anything else, like there's some communist crap, like what, they're just communists, okay? There's communism that they don't want to call themselves communists because they're like punk rock, whatever. I'm not talking, real anarchism is polycentric law. Like when the rubber hits the road, you're having a stateless society that is a society without a singular lawmaking entity. That's what we call polycentric law. Okay. Now, polycentric law, real anarchism, doesn't imply any specific property norms, and it doesn't imply any specific social norms. With polycentric law, you can have people, in order to be under the law and not be an outlaw, because being an outlaw means anyone can kill you with no legal consequence as you're outside the law. In order to not be an outlaw, they can say you have to pay for defense. And when I was sort of in the ANCAP community, when talking to ANCAPs about defense, it's like, they're like the equal people. They don't answer the question. They don't address the question. They're non-compos mentis. Their heads are in the clouds. They seem to not even be aware. And so, like I said, I read Hoppe's book, The Private Production of Defense, from cover to cover. Okay, which is something I rarely do nowadays. Typically, I prefer to just read, studies. And he's talking about this war insurance crap. Not that war insurance wouldn't be crappy in a stateless society to have, but it's a crappy solution to funding an army. And so he's talking about insurance, and I'm like, that's neat, Hoppe. When do you get to actually solving the free rider problem? Okay, people buy insurance for war damages. And those that just pay for war damages, they'll pay less than those who pay for insurance against war damages plus a military. So why would any individual pay for a military, right? The free rider problem. Right? And also, incidentally, there were some people who would just say, free rider problem? Not a problem. They just free ride. Like, okay. But the semi-serious response was Hoppe's insurance, war insurance. And I'm reading the book, and I'm halfway done with the book. I'm looking at the page number, I'm looking at the page counts, right? And I'm getting a little nervous. And as I turn the pages, not figuratively, I'm reading the PDF. As I turn the pages, I go, oh my God, he doesn't actually answer it. He doesn't actually answer it. Holy shit, you built this fucking Mises Institute and pushed anarcho-capitalism to the four winds, to the seven seas, and you don't answer the free rider problem of defense, you piece of... And so I answered it myself. Wow, what does this sound like? I'm answering the question myself. In the polycentric legal order, I think, okay, here's what you have to do. In the polycentric legal order, you have to pay a tax for defense. And if you don't pay, you're an outlaw and you get killed. That is how polycentric legal orders actually solved the problem, with taxation and conscription. And since anarcho-capitalists want a free market anyway, well, a state could create laws pertaining to property that are much more conducive to this free market thing than a polycentric legal order would. In fact, historically, polycentric legal orders were either communist or they upheld the traditional economy. And what is the traditional economy? It's basically all economies before the creation of common markets and transferable land property rights that originated most in England, leading to opening up of England as a singular common market as opposed to a patchwork of smaller markets. The traditional economy is a whole thing in and of itself. You could call it feudalism for now, I guess, but that's not really a good term. But if the point of anarcho-capitalism is the free market, then what really is the meaningful difference between a polycentric legal order and a state just instituting a free market? what it is we'll broadly call a free market. Well, one thing they would say is institutional capture. We have a state that can be captured by people with bucks. Okay, but why would polycentric law be immune to institutional capture? And the reality is, historically, all of these polycentric legal orders were replaced by states. So in a sense, they were all captured by someone. Okay, in polycentric legal order, they need judges. They need organizations that deal with the law, be it like, maybe people will trust religions, and so the church will act as sort of a lawgiver. Like, okay, well, can the church be captured? Okay. You have a certain amount of standardization of law, and so law is going to become institutionalized, so you can have institutions. Can't an institution be captured by people with daddy warbucks? And back then, none of the other ANCAPs even conceived of the problem in any meaningful way. We had guys saying this is just like random people on the internet saying stuff, but it's kind of funny. You had guys saying that soldiers would just work other jobs in the off season. They like work construction in between wars. And then when a war started, they'd fight for whoever was attacked. And I'm like, okay. I don't think there's any, what can you even say to that? It's like, you don't know how militaries work. What do we say to that? So without the purity of anarchism, what about Lolbertism otherwise? What about the rest of that? Well, without, a kind of coherent and complete ideology, sort of, emergent calculation and emergent balance of the market, where everything is properly in its place and it's done in this beautiful way that's just the culmination of all individual behavior. Okay, what about that? You have the state over here that institutes it all and protects it. But what about sort of that idea, that beautiful emergent order of the free market? It's not pure anymore because you have this thing, this state, this impurity, this archonic entity that's not part of the emergent order. But what about the remnant of that? Well, it comes down to a mundane utility calculation, because without anarchism, without total emergentism, then sort of the silver chain is broken, right? So now back to stats, right? Are countries with fewer regulations and lower taxes actually better off than countries with higher regulations and higher taxes? Well, for now, a little bit, but how much of that is correlation or causation, and how much of that is a function of capital flight? It may not be a better system if these countries were hermetically sealed from each other. They may have no effect, but one effect would be, lower taxes over here. I'm a guy with bucks who tends to pay a lot of taxes, so I'll just move all my wealth over here. And so that country becomes wealthier, not because they're generating more wealth internally, but because they're sucking up wealth from other countries because they have lower taxes. Okay, and so that's not a proper comparison, right? That's not a comparison of the system in and of itself. That's a comparison of how that system, interacts with other system with higher taxes or more, worker protections or whatever. Because sort of go back down to like a really stupid analysis of things. Guy works in the field. Guy works in the factory. Makes stuff. He makes thing. Okay, so we have thing. Is thing made more efficiently when you have competing firms versus a state that mandates you make thing versus, the state controlling all production of thing? Yeah, it does, as far as we can tell, right? This free market sort of thing, what it is we call the free market, tends to produce thing better than what it is we call central planning. Okay. Is thing made more efficiently if taxes are 10% instead of 30%? And the answer to that is rather decisively no. Okay? So variation in taxes within a certain range has no effect on how efficiently thing is made. Are people happier in a state with higher taxes and more goodies doled out to people, or in a state with lower taxes and less goodies doled out to people? Well, the answer is higher taxes and more goodies make people happier. And I think this is largely because the top 10% pay virtually all the taxes. So soak the rich makes, increases mass utility, right? Do you care about that? Is that immoral? Whatever. That's a question for another time. I would say it kind of is because, wealth is luck. But again, that's a whole, I would have to make a whole case for that, for wealth is luck. But anyway. So what's the problem? Well, capital flight. The rich will go to the countries where there's lower taxes. Okay, institute capital controls. Problem solved. Oh, that will make you poor somehow. What? It hasn't made China or Japan or Germany poor. They have strict capital controls. You can't just, if you make money in Germany, you can't just willy-nilly send it to whatever country you want. No, that's German money. That's wealth made by German people. Right? That's wealth made by Chinese people. You can't just take that away and send it to, Brazil or whatever. No, that's ours. Now, we believe in a market economy because that's efficient and that's good for us. Okay. And you can invest and you can make some money yourself, but you're spending that money in China, right? That all stays in China, right? You're not just blowing, like you made all that from China. That comes from the sweat of Chinese brows. You don't get to just blow it out to the four winds. Right? Now, so you do this, okay, well this makes foreign capital less likely to invest in, say, China, because when they invest in China, well, it's not liquid. They can't just pull it out. They can't invest in China and then just pull it out and then go invest in, Argentina or whatever and buy Argentinian bonds or whatever, right? It has to stay in China. Okay. So it makes foreign capital less likely to invest. Now, some will still invest because, they can make money in China. Now, they have to then spend whatever money's made in China, but they still get stuff from China, right? And still get some good stuff, right? But it's still a loss. So you get less foreign investment if you have capital controls. But guess what else? Your capital can't leave, and that's the gain. And really, frankly, you shouldn't be relying on investment that comes from smelly foreigners anyway. Why would you want a bunch of foreigners owning stuff in your country? That doesn't make sense, right? If you have good people in your country, the only reason you'd want that is if your country has like kind of crappy people, right? So certain countries tend to be more dependent and more interested in foreign investment than others. But if you got good people in your country, like China or Japan or Germany, okay, you don't need any foreign investment. None. You don't need 1 cent, because frankly, the amount of capital per person in Germany is going to be higher than almost any country on the planet, except for like little countries like Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, whatever. But any like major country, Germany is going to have about as much capital per person as any other country. All right. So the effects of the free movement of capital for Germany is going to be more so German capital leaving Germany than German capital moving in. Same with Japan. Not with China yet, but it will be the case with China eventually because of their genetics, right? China will become like Japan. Okay. And so if you have good people, you want capital controls, because the free movement of capital, primarily, if you got good people, the primary result of the free movement of capital is that capital leaves your country. Okay? You're not getting as much capital coming in to Japan as it is going out, because you got better people who save their money and are good at, investing and stuff. So you don't want that. So, and also it just works. It's not a theoretical thing. So this idea that you can't have capital controls is just stupid. So yeah, so raise taxes. It's not going to reduce the productivity of your economy. And to deal with, rich people, well, they're just going to leave. No, you're not, at least not with all your money. Okay. So no, you're not just going to leave. Okay, because we have laws saying you can't take your money out of the country. So, but long-term economic development. That's what they'll say. You need long-term economic development, and that comes from investment. And so from investment, you can't be taxing the rich because they invest more than anyone else. Okay, Guy, let's definancialize the brain here. Let's disaggregate the brain and think sort of at a basic material level. What are we talking about? What does economic development come from? It comes from two things. It comes from the invention of new technology and the distribution of that technology to people. Okay. Think about that for a moment if you need, but you really can't. That it's like definitionally true. That is what economic development is. It's stuff. It's the invention of stuff and people getting their hands on that stuff, right? Okay. Now, in a real material sense, that's what's actually happening. So, how do you develop new technology? Well, as it turns out, and this is a whole field in and of itself, how stuff gets invented. As it turns out, the best way to invent stuff is what is called basic research. And basic research is you get some guys and give them a bunch of cash and tell them to invent stuff, right? With no real direction. That's like the best way. Now, basic research is risky, right? And as a company who wants to make a profit, they will spend a disproportionate amount of their research money on R&D, on applied research, right? Not basic research, but applied research, and so where do you draw the line between applied research and basic research? That can be somewhat subjective, but private companies invest more in applied research. And they also do a lot of they do a lot of market research, right? Which is how can we increase our market share? Which of course that doesn't benefit society at all. That benefits that particular company, sure, fair enough. But society is not benefited by one company or another having a greater market share, except in terms of like the company that has more market share may have a slightly better product, but the difference between Southwest Airlines and Delta is like trivial, right? So it's not it doesn't really have much of an effect on the good of society, right? But what a state can do, because a state doesn't have to turn a profit ever, right? That's one thing people criticize government for, is that they're not calibrated by the market. They're not disciplined by the market. But that's one example here where it's wonderful, right? A state can just take a bunch of money and they can waste it in a whole host of fruitless ventures. They're not disciplined by the market one bit. They could just tax and spend. And that allows them to do a lot of really stupid stuff. But in this instance, in terms of basic economic development from basic research, that is fantastic, right? The state could take a whole lot of risk because they just get their money from taxes and they get it every year, no matter what. Tax and spend. So you could get a whole lot more basic research from the state. And then you don't even have the problem of intellectual property, because when companies do basic research and they invent stuff, they want to hold on to the property, right? And so only they can make this new thing, right? And that's good for them. Cool, whatever. But society would be better off if every firm that exists could just start making it straight away. Okay? But if you have the state doing basic research, they research something, it's in the state's interest to just give it away. And that's what they just, here you go, everyone can use it now. It's public research. Right? Wonderful. You get past the whole thorny IP issue. And of course, the state can spend far more money on research, period, than firms can, because they're literally just taxing and spending. And as I said, this can lead to this stupid stuff like the state funding like dumb art galleries. But whatever, in this case, the state can be the engine of economic development precisely because it's decoupled from market discipline. Now, thinking about, say, the 1800s, before they really had the steam engine, really. I mean, it existed, but it wasn't in widespread use. Was the lower standard of living back then, was that more a result of not having technologies, the technologies that we have today, or was it a result of just poorly utilizing existing technology of the time? That if they just use their technology at the time, they could get really close to our standard of living. No, that's stupid. Obviously, it's the former. They just didn't have stuff, right? Like, it doesn't matter how efficiently you use, horse and buggies. If you don't have steam engines or later internal combustion engines, you're not going to be able to do the kinds of things that a society that does have those things do. Even if that society is a freaking communist society, they're going to be better off because they have that tech. Okay? So, if anything, back then they more efficiently used what technology they had than we do. And all increasing market efficiencies by reducing regulations. And that's one area where Lolberts are generally correct, is that as a rule, regulations of all types, environmental regulations, worker safety regulations, and also just petty regulations like business licensing laws, just as a rule, Lolberts are correct about the effects of regulations. That's just a general good to reduce regulations. I mean, there's just specific regulations here and there. You say, no, we need to keep that. No, employees must wash hands. Yeah, okay. But as a general rule, reduction of regulations in the space that it's actually talked about, that actual cutting of regulations is actually proposed, as a rule, that's generally a good thing. Okay. But all that really does, all an increase in market efficiencies can do by making the tax structure better and making the regulatory structure better, all that can do is more efficiently utilize existing technologies. That is, it makes an economy reach its potential, but it doesn't raise the potential, right? The potential of an economy is capped by how much, by your upper limit of technology, by the best technology in the society. That's your cap. But Ryan, they'll say, in order to distribute that technology to the population, that requires investment. And taxing the rich lowers investment, since those are the people who invest the most. Okay. Well, Singapore has a solution for that. That's way better than Lolbertism, which is lower taxes on the rich and pray they'll use those savings from taxes on more investing as opposed to buying 50 more yachts or whatever. Just hoping, the Lolbert solution to getting tech into people's hands is that they'll invest more. Okay. And to get them to invest more, they just lower taxes. But okay, so that's sort of a hope and a prayer, right? How about you do what Singapore does, which is way better than Lolbertism, which is to literally force people to invest, right? In Singapore, you are legally required to invest a certain portion of your income. And if you don't invest that portion of your income, the state takes it away from you. Wow. Thanks, state. What a simple and elegant solution to that problem. Force people at gunpoint to invest. And they'll invest, and you'll get that technology distributed to the general population. So the state takes people's money, invests in a whole bunch of high-risk basic research because the state is immune to market risk, and then gives all the good stuff back to the public for free. They give everything back to the public for free, but the public is only going to use the good stuff. And then, in order to make sure that there's enough capital to distribute this new tech to everyone, they force everyone to invest in companies that will make quantum toasters or whatever. Wow, thanks, state. That's way better than an unfettered free market where companies are just going to fritter away making more efficient propeller aircraft and marketing to get a bigger piece of the pie in a zero-sum game with chronic underinvestment because the middle class doesn't invest enough. People cry about the savings rate in the U.S. being too low. Oh, I have a solution to that. Literally force people to save. Wow. Once you passed a law forcing people to save, the savings rate went right back up to exactly where you wanted it to be. Thanks, state. Your interventionism, i.e., pointing guns at people and occasionally pulling the trigger to make them do things they don't want to do, right? The violence inherent in the state, the gun in the room. Wow, that made things way better. Thanks, state. Anyway, that's a long rant there. But basically what I try to do is I try to make things work. Like, okay, you believe X. How do you show X is true and for real? Not from like a marketing to low info boobs perspective, like how does X become the dominant ideology? That's a separate question. I mean, how do we know X is true? And I also like name things that aren't named, like the equal people, because they're pushing equal. You know, you think all people are, you think evolution stopped at the neck. Okay, how do you show it? Or the multiracial project. Okay, you're getting all these people of different races, putting them in the same state, voting in the same elections, and we're supposed to accept this as a good idea? Why? What experiments were run to show that this will all work out before you decided on this as a policy to make the country, you know, majority brown? It'll work because equal is true. Oh, okay, show equal. Oh, that's right. Nobody ever does. Nobody ever shows that. They just critique Murray and Lynn or whatever. But anyway, I went far afield from what I was originally going to talk about, but whatever. People are asking for more content, and I guess this is content? I don't know. Anyway, going back to what I was originally talking about, at the beginning of this video, do you remember that? Remember when we were talking about, like, the heritability of beliefs? I remember. So, why people are closed-minded, you know, and I gave some evolutionary reasons. Remember that? Boy, those were some times. But here's another thought I had about that, and it's not quite fully formed. When you're saying someone is wrong about something, to some degree, because everything is heritable, everything has some genetic basis in it, even though it's all environmentally contextualized variants within an environment, right? And of course, and the more similar the environment, the more the reigning variants will be genetic, blah. To some degree, their disagreement with you is a genetic disagreement, right? To use the vulgar terminology on that. That's not technically true, but you know what I mean. When you say someone is wrong about their high or low tolerance for inequality, or they're wrong for wanting to keep out smelly foreigners or bring in more smelly foreigners, well, those beliefs are partly influenced by genetics. And you're saying their genetics are wrong. At least in part. You're also saying that their life experience is wrong, or their evaluation of what they have read is wrong, or what they have read is wrong. You know, the phrase, you are wrong, not, oh, that thing you said is incorrect. No, you are wrong. You are incorrect. And somehow I sort of think that the people that phrase came about because it really drives at a truth. It's meaningful. You are wrong. Not what you said is incorrect. No, you are wrong. Because if someone is wrong about something, they are wrong. Their life experience is wrong. And or their genetics are wrong. To the extent their belief on this topic is influenced by their genetic predisposition to perhaps say, you know, fairness. Their fairness response is this or that. Their tolerance for inequality is whatever. Their tolerance for bringing in smelly foreigners is whatever. Or their tolerance for, you know, authority and rigid hierarchy. Right? That's almost certainly a heritable thing. You know, you're saying that they are wrong in that. And so, and given that all political positions, they are to some extent influenced by these genetically based tendencies and sort of collectivism, tendencies in tolerance for unfairness, tendencies towards tolerance for smelly foreigners, etc., etc. And I think when you hit up against the more genetically based things, inequality and immigration, that's where you get the most rancor, because that is, at least I think, where you have the most genetic influence on people's positions. So when you say someone is wrong about race issues, you're saying their genetic being is faulty. Right? The core of their being is rotten. Okay? You want to bring in a bunch of people who will drive your homeland into the dirt. They will take it over. They will treat you as a despised minority and wreck everything your civilization has achieved. They will take all of your stuff, and they will treat your children and your grandparents like crap, and you are genetically predisposed to not just allow this to happen, but to actively instigate it. Now, nobody says this explicitly, but I think that's the implied accusation whenever you say someone is wrong for wanting to have mass immigration or racial integration or whatever. And so you get a lot of resistance, because the alternative being that they must admit that their core being is rotten, that they're kind of like a golem that wants to turn all that is good and beautiful and understanding into Mordor. Like in the past, this was a debatable thing. Should we have Italians? Should we bring in the Irish? Well, for those groups, costs and benefits of having new and different people, debatable. But now it's, should we bring in Somalis? Should we bring in Nigerians? And the consequences of that are much clearer and stark. But in the past, you didn't have the same kind of hysterical multiracialism, because Hitler killed a bunch of white people, so you have to be ruled by Africans now, right? In the past, people were much less propagandized about the effects of diversity, and the kinds of diversity that were being proposed, it was much more debatable. You had debates about, should we bring in Chinese people? Should we bring in Italian? Should we bring in Spanish? Should we bring in Eastern Europeans? Debatable things. Today, with the kind of groups that are being brought in, the facts are super obvious about what the effects of bringing more Somalis in are going to be. But the demands that you must lose everything and turn Gondor into Mordor, or else you're a bad person, this is now just so hysterical, and you can't just say, hey, maybe some people are bad people. Maybe not bring in awful people. And if you want to say, how dare you say certain people are bad people? Well, is nobody bad? Right? Are there no bad people? I mean, if these aren't bad people, then what are bad people? Do we just say, there's no bad people? Oh, wonderful. World's a great place now. Like what? Anyway. But the thing is, if you say this stuff, well, you're an awful person. You don't want to be overrun by orcs. You're the orc. But what this does is creates a whole class of people who, because it's getting so extreme and so polarized and so severe now, you get a whole class of people who now stop believing in institutions. And if they don't believe in the institutions anymore, they can't trust them, they're cast about. It's sort of writ large, my little story, what happened to little Ryan. I couldn't trust the church. What happens? Well, people think for themselves. And when people think for themselves, well, that leads to all manner of great and terrible things. And the kinds of beliefs you must hold to retain faith in those institutions, they just get crazier and crazier. I don't know how much my experience can generalize, and maybe it's a certain genetic makeup that forces me to try to make things work. But I think if you try to get people to try to make things work, like make it work, maybe that can lead them down the same path I went. Sort of an anticlimactic thing I want to say here. Modern politics, it's full of language. Did you know that? It has language in it. Iowa has counties. And you get changes in labels and language, and this creates, I think, an illusion of radical change in belief. what I think is really happening is that there are some changes in substantive positions that people have. But these substantive positions these substantive position changes, it's like being for, say you go to being for reducing immigration. That this is a function of beliefs held in sets, right? You're part of this group and this group has this set of beliefs, so you believe this set. And then there's a layer on top of that, sort of the group set of beliefs you identify with, and that's the label. So you have people with their genetic predisposition, their genetic baseline of belief. What, if you didn't interfere with them, or you put everyone in identical environments, what their tendency would be, right? Now, what their baseline beliefs, what their true substantive beliefs, not their, sort of, not divorced from any group effects. Like people will conform to groups and sort of come to outright believe or sort of think they believe what the group believes because they're in the group. It's sort of that gray zone where, like, do you believe this or not believe this? Well, you're in the group, so you say believe it, but you also kind of believe it, but you also sort of know that once you're not in this group, you'll stop believing it. People are weird, right? But what I'm talking about is divorced from the group effects, like your true beliefs. That can be changed through conditioning and argument, what their true beliefs on anything are, but only by like 20%, I think. I think you can change true belief by around like 20%. Then there are the go-along beliefs that they will hold, say they hold, kind of go along with just because they're part of the group they're part of, right? And so that's the second level. And then there's a third level, and that is labels and party ID. I'm calling myself a capitalist. I support Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, state-run public schools, farm subsidies. I am a capitalist, right? That sort of thing, right? Like the Republican capitalist. Yeah, base and superstructure, right? The base of a person can contort, like their true belief, that they can contort about 20%, but without repeated conditioning, the base of a person will default sort of to, like their genetic baseline. So it's like a, not quite as malleable as Jell-O, but sort of like Jell-O, but a little bit stiffer, right? And so you can twist that around, but as soon as you stop pushing, as soon as the conditioning stops, it sort of goes back to its original shape. And that's sort of like the baseline. And the original shape, that's their genetic baseline. And you can push and push and push, but it'll snap back once the conditioning goes away for about, 2 or 3 years. Once you stop the conditioning, they'll go back to their genetic beliefs. But then the superstructure, you have group identity, and they have self-censorship to conform to the group, but also that weird, I sort of believe this, but I also know I'll stop believing this once I leave the group sort of thing. Now, of course, conformity to a group is itself genetically evolved behavior, but for sanity's sake, we'll keep it separate. Okay. And then you have another layer of superstructure, the second layer of superstructure, which is party ID and sort of the language game of politics. So what a smart political movement needs to do is find a way to operationalize and test for the genetic base of someone. And I think that game of how much inequality you're willing to tolerate in terms of like one person deciding how much money to give you, I think that's sort of a good test for sort of the latent socialism of a person. And the latent socialism of a person is not necessarily going to correspond very well to how much they say support the Democrat Party, right? Because obviously I have a very high level. I don't think of any. I don't think you could have in any measurable way. I'm sure there's people who have higher levels of latent socialism than me, but I don't think in any measurable way. Because like any test you do in terms of dividing up the money, I will reject anything but pure equality. Right. So on that test, I would max out that test. Right. But that would be a good test to give to people to test how much latent socialism they have, for example. And there's no point in trying to change someone's superstructure today from our position if their superstructure is already in alignment with their base, at least not while there are people whose base and superstructure are radically out of alignment. Okay, I have a tendency to try to explain things more after I've already said them, and that tends to make people actually more confused than just the first round of explanation, so I'll stop there. I'll put a bow on that and leave it there, and I'll just end this really long audio